Hey there, everyone. That sexy nerd is back again, and we're here watching the Pacific with history buffs. Now, I have never actually seen this show. I did want to watch it. Um, that and Band of Brothers. I still have never watched it. And until I can figure out how to get these things past copyright, which please let me know in the comments if anybody of you know. I can't get any movies up that I know of, or anything, any TV show or anything like that. So, but yeah, like I said, I did think about watching this show, but I could never really stick around for it. It took me a while to get into some HBO shows, and really, when I say HBO shows, I mean mostly The Sopranos. Mm, I love The Sopranos so much. I've still never watched The Wire. Um, You'd have to put a gun to my head to make me watch Sex in the City. Uh, no, that's not true. I've actually watched a lot of Sex in the City, unfortunately. I know a lot of women. Uh, and, it's not been. I tried watching Band of Brothers a little while ago, but I still haven't finished it. And the Pacific, like, I think the most significant thing is that, like, Tim from Jurassic Park is in this movie, or is in this show or something like that. And I almost watched it because of that, but I heard it got canceled, or I don't know, some confusing stuff happened with this show. But I still heard it was good. So and I'd love to. Also when it first came out, I wasn't as mature, and I guess my love of World War II hadn't really manifested yet, or my love of history for that matter. Uh, yeah, it did seem interesting at the time, but it's not interesting enough for me to watch it. Um, but yeah, this always seemed very interesting, and I'm actually surprised he's covering it, and it's so long. It's nearly an hour and a half, so we're gonna be here for a while, guys, and I'm all here for it. Don't get me wrong. So without further ado, let's just get into the video. And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And remember, sign up for my Patreon to get full access to all my. And remember, sign up for my Patreon for my full-length reactions to all my latest videos. And let's do this thing, y'all.
Hello and welcome, History Buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and today we'll be tackling one of my most requested reviews of all time, HBO's Second World War miniseries.
Oh, so Tom Hanks did produce this thing, just like Band of Brothers and Steven Spielberg. Wow, good job, great job.
The Pacific. Released 9 years after its European sister show, this spiritual sequel had a lot to live up to. And as we move along, I'll compare the facts of the source material, largely drawn directly from the accounts of the soldiers on the ground, to the 10 episodes of the blockbuster miniseries. The stated goal of this series was to take us under the helmet of the US Marines. Let's find out just how snugly that helmet fits. Without further ado, this is the Pacific.
Wow, this is great. Man, how did I miss this?
So the most obvious change from Band of Brothers to the Pacific is the shift from following a single company to an entire division as seen through the eyes of 3 Marines. And when you consider that there are 4 companies in a battalion, 4 battalions in a regiment, and 4 regiments in the 1st Marine Division, that's quite a big difference. But why fix what isn't broken? To answer that, we need to understand 2 things: the unique nature of the war in the Pacific, and the Hollywood landscape back in 2008. Historically, Hollywood has focused more on the conflict with the Nazis in Europe, and this includes some of the best war films and shows ever made. Of course, there have also been great movies set in the Pacific theatre, but even now, if you Google World War II films, only 2 of the 10 most popular take place there, and both came out after this series. And watching this show, it's easy to see why. Does
Hacksaw Ridge take place in the Pacific Theater? For some reason, I don't know why. I thought that it actually took place in Eastern Europe. I mean, not in Eastern Europe, in Europe. Wow.
Side of the war played out in alien environments on tiny islands almost no one in the US had ever heard of. And it was fought against an often invisible enemy that preferred to attack at night. And the men who fought in it lacked long-term unit cohesion because jungle combat created such a high level of turnover. Basically, they were either dying, falling sick, or getting wounded too quickly. Not exactly an easy story to adapt into a miniseries. Not to mention the challenge of finding a roster of characters to follow that really made it through the Pacific campaign from beginning to end. There are other differences too that add to the challenge. Obviously, no one would deny the depths of horrors faced on the European battlefields, but as Tom Hanks himself puts it, war in the Asia-Pacific had a different DNA.
Yeah.
At least a third, and possibly closer to half of the deaths in the Second World War, happened there. In Europe, just over one non-combatant died for every one military death. In the Asia-Pacific, that number jumped between 3 and 5. Add to that Japan's fanaticism to their warrior code of Bushido, which outlawed surrender, and you have what amounts to a primal battle for survival. Indeed, it was extremely rare to take a Japanese soldier, sailor, or airman alive. Between 1937 and 1945, there wasn't a single organized surrender of any Japanese unit. That meant unwinnable encounters often turned into suicidal bloodbaths. Under these circumstances, the ferocity that some Americans became capable of is understandable, but that doesn't necessarily make it any more palatable to audiences. Needless to say, there is no shortage of terrifying spectacle and fascinating history on this front. Yet for all these reasons, it still gets less attention from Hollywood, which is part of why the producers of the Pacific wanted to come back to finish the job.
When Band of Brothers came out, many people who fought in the Pacific said, "What about us guys? We did something too. We made a major contribution."
And they're absolutely right. So the producers knew they'd have to tackle the Pacific. But who should the story follow? Band of Brothers traced the progress of the paratroopers of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, from Normandy to the Eagle's Nest. That process was made easier by a book retelling the company's exploits by Stephen E. Ambrose, also called Band of Brothers, which served as the main historical source for the events of the series. Now, it's a common misconception that the Pacific is also based on a book that shares its name, written by Stephen Ambrose's son, Hugh, but that's not actually the case. The book was intended as a companion volume to the show and released around the same time. Hugh was, however, a project consultant on the series. And so, alongside executive producer and screenwriter Bruce McKenna, he was involved in choosing the central characters. According to McKenna, they first considered following a group of naval aviators, then a ship, and even a submarine, before finally settling on 3 men of the 1st Marine Division. But before we get to them, let's start with the 1st Marine Division. Robert Leckie, Eugene Sledge, and John Basilone. Born in Pennsylvania and raised in New Jersey, he was working as a feature writer for the newspaper The Bergen Record when the Japanese Empire attacked Pearl Harbor. In response to what he saw, Leckie volunteered at the age of 21.
I joined the Marines. Thought I'd do my bit.
Roberts got his first experience of combat on Guadalcanal as an assistant machine gunner in H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Regiment, 1st Marine Division. Later he fought on Cape Gloucester in the battalion intelligence section, and his final battle was on Peleliu, where he suffered a concussion and shell shock. Leckie's memoir, Helmet for My Pillow, earned him a huge fan in screenwriter Bruce McKenna, who was impressed by his talent for poetic description, even if Leckie did occasionally let it get the better of the truth. As McKenna puts it, you have to realize he did take some liberties. He was an artistic writer. Reading the book, you do get the sense that he's writing poetry, which he actually did during the war. You also quickly discover his complicated relationship with authority, which led to him being demoted and even thrown in the brig on multiple occasions.
Really?
By contrast, Eugene Sledgehammer Sledge entered the Corps as a straight-laced boy with a deep reverence for the culture of the Marines. At only 19, and to the dismay of his parents, he deliberately flunked out of the Georgia Tech V-12 officer program so he could ship out sooner as a private.
Give me some time to break the news to you, Mom.
Sledge entered K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment, 1st
Could have been an
Marine
officer?
as a mortarman, just in time for its assault on Peleliu. Ambrose
Wow.
and McKenna wanted Sledge because of his own fantastic memoir, With the Old Breed on Peleliu and Okinawa, which vividly and meticulously recounts his experiences on those islands. Personally, I can't recommend his book highly enough. There's absolutely no sugarcoating in Sledge's retelling, and you get what I think is a very direct sense of what he witnessed. His other book, China Marine, which covers his post-war duty in China and eventual return to the US, was also used for reference. Last but not least, we have John Manila Basilone, who is a very different character in many ways. Basilone is the only one of the 3 to have served before the war, and is also the only one to have died in it. Born in New York to first-generation Italian immigrants, Basilone joined the
He looks
army
Italian.
in 1936, and much of that service was spent in the Philippines, hence the nickname Manila. Then in July 1940, apparently looking for a stiffer challenge, John enlisted with the Marines, where he would become a household name.
I'm putting you in for a medal, John.
On Guadalcanal, his actions in charge of a machine
Oh,
gun
yeah,
section
no.
in Company D, 1st Battalion, 7th Regiment, 1st Marine Division earned him the Congressional Medal of Honor. The fame led to John being called up for a war bond drive back in the US. Unsatisfied with the idea of a cushy retirement, he volunteered to return to combat on Iwo Jima, where he was ultimately killed on February 19, 1945. Since Basilone never wrote a memoir of his own, sources for his story included Iwo Jima Red Blood, Black Sand by machine gunner Chuck Tatum, who served under John and witnessed his death, as well as
Really?
interviews with his surviving friends and wife, Lena. A major challenge for the show was to weave these men's stories together in a satisfying way. While they all served in the 1st Marine Division, there's no record of them ever meeting, and to be honest, that's not surprising. Easy
Why,
Company
yeah.
had 140 men and 7 officers, whereas the 1st Marine Division had a nominal strength of 16,000. Sledge, Leckie, and Basilone were split across 3 regiments, each averaging 4,000 men, namely the 1st, 5th, and 7th Infantry Regiments. Now, as audiences, we often expect the central characters of our stories to interact, so you might think that a serious leap would be needed to make for a satisfying narrative. So did Ambrose and McKenna. That is, until they interviewed Sidney Phillips, a childhood friend of Sledge's, who also served in the 1st Marine Division. Seeing Sid go off to war had helped fuel Sledge's desperation to get involved as soon as possible. As it turned out, Sid was also in Leckie's company on Guadalcanal, so he was the perfect candidate to pass the torch. That said, there's no evidence that Sledge and Leckie ever met in the way that they do in the series.
Sid was my best customer.
When you're finished, please return it to the Pacific Library of Congress.
But McKenna argues anyone who wanted a book would go and see Robert Leckie, and Sledge was a reader, so this isn't outside the realm of possibility. As historical inaccuracies go, this one is forgivable, if a little bit of a stretch. Similarly dubious is the first scene of the series, which has Robert Leckie meeting his future wife, Vera Keller, outside St. Mary's Church. This is definitely in character for Leckie as an Irish Catholic, who would later write 2 books on Catholicism. But it seems unlikely for Vera, who's quoted as saying, "I'm Presbyterian, so why would I be going to a Catholic church?" This might seem like a small thing, but the series uses the promise he gives to write to Vera as a way to justify his narration at various points.
Dear Vera, it seems a lifetime since we met outside St. Mary's.
Dear Vera, it's raining.
Dear Vera.
Dear Vera.
However, as the real Vera herself said, he never wrote to me. We didn't have that kind of relationship, not until after the war. There's also a bit of creative license taken with Eugene Sledge's entry into the conflict. In the series, it's clear that his mother and father don't want him to go. His mother is worried because she already has one son in the line of fire, while his father, a prominent doctor, worries about what it'll do to him mentally.
The worst thing about treating those combat boys from the Great War wasn't that they had had their flesh torn. It was that they had had their souls torn out.
Luckily for them, Eugene can't go anyway because of a heart murmur. This is presented as the reason why he doesn't leave with Sid in the first episode. Then in episode 2, the murmur goes away and Dr. Sledge finally gives his blessing.
Goes away?
Although Eugene did have health problems, these weren't really the cause of the delay. As Sledge describes in his book, his parents didn't want him to be, quote, cannon fodder as an enlisted man. They wanted him to finish college and then seek an officer's commission in a technical branch of the army. Eugene managed to negotiate a compromise, the new V-12 officer training program at Georgia Tech. By 1942, the Navy was struggling to produce enough officers, and the lowering of the draft age threatened to send promising candidates into the forces as enlisted men. V-12 offered a solution by exempting would-be officers from the draft in exchange for their commitment to finish college and enter the Navy. By the time the program was ended, it had produced 60,000 Navy and Marine Corps officers. Eugene Sledge wasn't one of them. He started there July 1943 but didn't stay long. He found his classes frustrating in the context of the war and worried that it would all be over before he got there. At the end of his first semester, he deliberately flunked out so he could enter the Corps as an enlisted man. He would later see this as naive, But Sledge wasn't alone in his worries about missing the action. When the fighting began on Guadalcanal in August 1942, John Basilone was stationed with the 7th Marines on Samoa.
Hey.
They had been sent there to repel an expected Japanese assault that never materialized. The men of the regiment were itching to get involved. They'd soon get their wish.
Japanese are in the
his
process
name.
of taking half of the world, and they mean to keep it with death from the air, land, and sea. Here is what the Japs are not expecting. The United States Marine Corps.
The first 2 episodes of The Pacific focus on the fight for Guadalcanal, part of the Solomon Islands chain in the South Pacific. And if there was one word to describe the preparations for that offensive, it would be chaotic. The 1st Division under Major General Alexander Van der Grift was filled with Pearl Harbor enlistees, many of them teenagers in serious need of further training. But Admiral Ernest King, commander of the US fleet and the architect of the campaign, had promised Van der Grift 6 months to provide the necessary instruction. So, all okay then? Actually, no. Events moved too quickly, and Van der Grift was instead forced to prepare for the first American offensive of the war within 3 weeks of arriving in New Zealand. All this should indicate just how pressing the need for this assault really was. Midway may have halted the Japanese offensive in the Central Pacific, but Emperor Hirohito's forces were still very much on the attack in the south. Even more worrying, by the spring of 1942, the Axis powers were in a position to pull off what could have been the decisive maneuver of the war. The fear was that if the Japanese Navy could advance across the Indian Ocean, meeting a land thrust by Germany down through the Middle East, the situation for the Allies would be catastrophic.
What? Wait. Why would they do that? What, just to connect with Germany? That makes... Also, Libya's a part of, like, the Axis powers in World War II? I don't... Wow.
Germany down through the Middle East,
Oh.
the situation for the Allies would be catastrophic. The move could cut off their last link to China, probably taking it out of action. Not only that, but it also had the potential to deal serious damage to British participation by collapsing its positions in India and the Middle East. And, as if that wasn't enough, it would also have blocked the main route for material from the West to the Soviet Union, weakening their defense against the Nazis. King was determined to prevent this outcome and not to give Japan time to fortify its defensive perimeter. He knew that if the US could mount an early offensive in the Pacific without undermining the Europe First strategy, it would make the job of defeating the Japanese much less costly in the long run. And given how bloody it would turn out to be regardless, this seems to have been a wise call. It also had the added benefit of taking pressure off the USSR by distracting the Japanese from a potential attack against the Soviets. This would help keep them in the war until a Western front could be opened. So then, out of all the islands in the Pacific, why Guadalcanal? Well, US radio intelligence suggested that Japan was planning to build an airbase there, which could endanger the crucial shipping and lines of communication between the US, Australia, and New Zealand. The operation was to be called Watchtower, and also involved invasions of the nearby Tulagi and Gavutu Tanimbogo. Success would need the full force of the 1st Marine Division, including Basilone and the 7th Regiment currently stationed on Samoa. But the honor of the first landings on Guadalcanal itself fell to the 5th Regiment, followed by the 1st, including Robert Leckie. And how it went down is captured brilliantly in the show because it plays on the audience's expectations of films like Saving Private Ryan. It's really built up the tension of the landing, so anyone who doesn't know the details will be expecting it to be a bloody mess on the beach.
No.
But just like in real life, the landing is unopposed.
No, they're waiting for them to get in. They want them to get in. The Japanese didn't fight
Lucky
that
Lucky
way.
was living up to his nickname. Despite all the chaos around the planning of the invasion and the general lack of experience of the Marines, the weather was on their side.
Oh.
Thick cloud cover had hidden their task force from Japanese spy planes.
My
So
mistake.
the landings on the 7th of August scored a complete strategic and tactical surprise.
Really?
Also, because construction was ongoing on the airbase and the Japanese had not expected an offensive until 1943, most of the garrison on the island were Korean laborers. They understandably fled their preliminary naval bombardment, leaving the US Marines to land 11,000 troops with little resistance.
Oh,
While
that's
following their
crazy!
US troops occupied the
Hey,
unfinished
look, I know
airfield.
you.
That was their primary objective. Sadly, this luck wouldn't last. A task force of Japanese cruisers and a destroyer from the 8th Fleet
Oh,
raced
shit.
to Savo an island off the northwestern coast of Guadalcanal. There, on the 8th of August, 1942, it dealt the US Navy its worst ever defeat at sea. 1 Australian and 3 American cruisers were sunk, while the Japanese took almost no damage in return.
Damn.
Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was forced to withdraw his transports and their escorts.
Bon voyage.
Yeah, well, she went down with half the battalion's ammo, most of our grub and medical supplies.
No!
And all our asswipe.
Fuck.
Let's dig in, Marines.
Only half of their supplies had been unloaded, and some Marines hadn't disembarked. Those that made it to the island were left isolated and faced desperate shortages.
Damn it!
Meanwhile, Japanese ships and planes were free to bombard the trapped leathernecks at will. Around this time, an H Company patrol came across Marines whose bodies had been mutilated and desecrated by the Japanese. Now, it might seem like the show's vilifying the enemy for the sake of drama, and Lecky doesn't mention it in his book, but this depiction was an accurate feature of the war with Japan. Sledge later recounted finding Marines who'd had their genitals cut off and forced into their mouths. Now, that's not to say that Americans were above mistreatment of enemy corpses.
Just not
For
that
example,
bad.
in episode 2, we see a Japanese skull being used to make a warning sign. A practice which definitely did happen, as shown in this photo. But as Sledge remembers, I never saw a Marine commit the kind of barbaric mutilation the Japanese committed if they had access to our dead.
Yep.
And as we'll see later, he wasn't one to pull punches when describing instances of American brutality. For now, it's Lecky's show,
hell
and
was
despite
that?
the deprivations, the Leathernecks endured. They even completed the airfield, naming it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a dive bomber pilot killed at Midway. The first US planes to be permanently stationed there landed on August 20th, 1942, giving a big boost to morale. However, that same day, the Japanese began landing ground forces to retake the airfield. First to arrive was a reinforced battalion under Colonel Keanu Ichiki. Bad intel had Ichiki believing the total US troop strength on the island was as low as 2,000, so he must have felt that mopping them up would be short work for his 900 seasoned soldiers. After all, these Americans were new to war, whereas the Japanese had been fighting for 5 years and considered themselves to be a supreme warrior race. Now, was this assumption arrogant? Absolutely. But it's easy to forget that at this point, the record of the Axis forces was a near unbroken series of victories. The Allies needed a win, if only to prove to themselves that they could hack it against these supposed super soldiers. And they got one. Beginning just after midnight, on the 21st of August, the jungle on the eastern bank of the Ilu River came alive with Japanese attackers. The Marines of the 2nd Battalion opened up with rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire from well-dug-in positions.
What?
Some of it from Lecky's machine gun pit and Sid's mortar squad. Although, as the assistant, Lecky wasn't the one firing. Luckily, the Marines had been warned of an imminent attack in the area by a heroic islander that had been left for dead by the Japanese.
What?
So when the ambush began, the 2nd Battalion opened up with machine gun and mortar fire from well-dug-in positions. Relying on swords and bayonets, wave upon wave of charging enemies fell in the hail of gunfire. When the fighting was over, 777 Japanese lay dead, including Colonel Ichiki, with only about 40 Americans killed.
Really?
The mouth of the Ilu River was choked with corpses. Now, some of you may have noticed I said Ilu. This encounter is known to history as the Battle of Tanara River,
Yes.
or the Battle of Alligator Creek, the latter being the label displayed in the episode. Whilst it's true that the Marines thought they were on the banks of the Tanaru, but that was only because some genius had got the labels the wrong way round when drawing up their maps. The name Alligator Creek was applied by the Marines themselves, mistaking the crocodiles they saw moving up and down the river, and which later feasted on the bodies of dead Japanese. In the aftermath of the battle, everyone learned an important lesson that would define the savage rules of warfare in the Pacific. They knew Japanese soldiers would rather die than surrender, but they did not expect wounded Japanese to routinely kill anyone trying to help them.
Whoa!
The Marines quickly adopted a merciless approach to survive by shooting or bayoneting every enemy casualty.
So, speaking of that, speaking of the crocodiles, getting on the crocodiles for a little bit, There's actually a story where a whole bunch of, like, a whole regiment of Japanese soldiers were actually eaten by crocodiles because had gotten so used to eating the Japanese soldiers on there. They actually were able to eat like some live ones as well. So don't think that just the dead ones were being eaten. Live ones were being eaten too.
Meanwhile, the Japanese were also adjusting their approach, with US planes now stationed on Guadalcanal, known as the Cactus Air Force because the island's code name was Cactus. The Japanese began sneaking in at night. Dubbed the Tokyo Express, these destroyers and cruisers would race down the slot, the channel that runs through the center of the Solomon Islands, to deliver men and supplies to the island and bombard American positions. Having failed to take the airfield with a battalion, the Japanese next tried a brigade. On the 11th and 12th of September 1942, Major General Kawataki Kawaguchi's 35th Brigade attempted to break through the positions of the 1st Marine Raiders. But with help from reinforcements of the Marine Parachutes Battalion, the line held. At last, realizing the scale of the challenge, the Japanese committed an entire division. But not before bombarding Henderson Field, nearly 1,000 shells fired from 2 battleships. This remains the most intense single bombardment American forces have ever faced, reflected in the fact that the Marines simply refer to it as the bombardment. The bombardments left American air power on the island so weak that the Japanese were able to land troops from a 5-ship convoy in broad daylight. Together, these two events gave US officials the jitters, and so they started to prepare the public for defeat on Guadalcanal. The New York Times basically published a eulogy for the troops stationed there, saying, "Guadalcanal, the name will not die out of the memories of this generation. It will endure in honor." But apparently no one informed John Basilone and the men of the 1st Battalion 7th Marines that they were already dead. Their leader, Chesty Puller, was a veteran of the Banana Wars and would go on to become the most decorated Marine in the Corps' history. At only 75% of their authorized strength, his battalion was tasked with holding a sector south of the airfield, usually defended by 2 full-strength battalions. Among them, Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 machine gun sections, which he'd ordered dug in 40 yards apart. At around 10 p.m. on the 24th of October, 1942, the phone rang.
I got the whole fucking damn army headed your way.
Events that followed were the subject of John's Medal of Honor citation. It reads, "In a fierce frontal attack with the Japanese blasting its guns with grenades and mortar fire, one of Sergeant Basilone's sections, with its gun crews, was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to carry on. Moving an extra gun into position, he placed it in action. Then, under continued fire, repaired another, and personally manned it, gallantly holding his line until replacements arrived. A little later, with ammunition critically low and the supply lines cut off, Sergeant Basilone, at great risk of his life and in the face of continued enemy attack, battled his way through hostile lines with urgently needed shells for his gunners, thereby contributing in large measure to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment." And that's almost exactly how it plays out on screen. But there are some interesting differences worth mentioning, especially since the details are so well documented. When Basilone arrived at his overrun 2nd machine gun section, the 2 men still alive there were Cecil Evans and Billy Joe Crumpton. In the show, the gunner in this pit is J.P. Morgan, a close friend of Basilone's, but the real J.P. wasn't there. He was in charge of another machine gun section. Either way, there were 2 guns in the pit, not 1, and Basilone found that neither was firing. The first had been destroyed and the other had a malfunction. In the show, the single machine gun is simply out of ammo. I imagine this is because they didn't want to make JP look ineffective. Anyway, after a while, the other gunner, Crumpton, became incapacitated, at which point John started rolling between the 2 guns at intervals, laying down a high rate of fire, which prevented overheating. Again, this isn't in the show, possibly because it seems so incredible to pull off. And speaking of overheating, Basilone would have known not to fire his machine gun like this. Holding down the trigger was a surefire way to burn out the barrel, which would then need to be replaced. Part of what's so impressive is that Baz alone was able to stick to the controlled bursts needed to keep both guns in action for the rest of the night. At times, John was forced to switch to his pistol to deal with an enemy soldier who had closed the distance. When ammo ran low, he raced through enemy territory to get more.
Oh! No! Oh, nice shot.
Now, despite how Hollywood this all may seem, it's actually a pretty accurate description.
What?
John really did freehand his machine gun like this,
What?
sustaining burns to his hands in the process.
What?
He may even have pushed over a pile of bodies to clear the firing range for his guns. However, the death of his friend Manny is the only other major change. The sole reference to this Manny that I could find is in Ambrose's book, where he is described as a friend of John's in Able Company who actually survived the night. His survival was as miraculous as everyone else's. The next morning, when it was all over, Puller inspected the line. He reported that, and I quote, "There are nearly 1,000 Japs, dead Japs out in front, and several hundred also dead between our lines and the wires." Someone counted 38 dead enemies stacked immediately in front of John's position. In the aftermath of this battle,
38.
the Empire of Japan's days on Guadalcanal were numbered. By November, the US Navy was able to land troops on the island faster than the Japanese.
That is fantastic.
Meanwhile, an attempted fourth offensive was stopped short by a combination of US naval and air forces. Finally, in December 1942, the Emperor himself sanctioned a full withdrawal from the island. In total, 7,100 Americans died to take Guadalcanal, but the Japanese had the worst of it. Their poor intelligence and wasteful tactics combined with the unexpected resolve of their enemy had cost them 29,883 dead.
Wow.
As the war in the Pacific drew on, tactical revisions by the Japanese would cause this ratio to drastically worsen for US forces. For now, though, victory on Guadalcanal provided much-needed proof that Americans could go toe-to-toe with the Japanese and come out on top. With that feather in their cap, the Marines of the 1st Division left to go get some well-earned rest.
Want a new
Yeah.
career but don't have experience?
Prior to the Google UX design certificate, I didn't have any experience.
The Marines began arriving in Melbourne on the 12th of January 1943, where they were met with huge affection from the public, who saw them as the saviours of Australia. The 1st Regiment, including Roberts Leckie, was to be quartered at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. At its peak, the MCG held 3,600 troops, including 184 officers. There, despite the lack of privacy afforded by the improvised bunks erected in the stands, they thought they must be in heaven. Leckie, for his part, couldn't quite believe his good fortune. His regiment had the best seats of the house and direct access to what he called the Great Debauch. In other words, they were only a mile's walk away from the centre of Melbourne.
MPs are just giving up. Couldn't they do that? Everyone's going AWOL, nobody's stopping them. Oh, I've got to be a part of this.
On arrival, though, the men were understandably in pretty poor health. As many as 7,000 came down with malaria in the first few weeks.
No.
When the doctor in charge of the US Army General Hospital saw the Marines disembarking, he told General Vandergrift, "Had I room, I would suggest we send this whole regiment to the hospital." But their physical condition didn't stop them making the most of their leave. Many were offered lodgings in the homes of Australian families, while others tried to find themselves an Aussie girl. In this, they faced an unusual lack of competition from other servicemen, to begin with at least. Later on, members of the 9th Australian Division arrived en route to New Guinea. They had fought in North Africa at Tobruk and El Alamein and had no qualms defending their credentials in pub brawls with Marines. This culminated in what became known as the Battle of Melbourne, which had to be broken up by mounted police. At last, a famous beer party at the MCG in March brought an end to hostilities, proving alcohol's ability to end conflict as well as create it.
Let us buy you the next round of drinks. Otherwise, what kind of host would we be? Alan, another round of drinks for the Cowboy Yanks.
That left more time for chasing women, and, as the division historian wrote, there were many engagements and few marriages. Episode 3 of The Pacific captures the general atmosphere and many of the common occurrences which accompany the Marines' stay on Australia, but some creative liberties are taken. For example, in the show, Leckie falls for a girl called Stella on the first night, and they end up dating for the rest of his time in Melbourne. In real life, Leckie actually spent that night negotiating with someone named Gwen over whether they could have sex without him first proposing marriage. After that, there was Molly, whom Lecky had a fight with about another girl. Incidentally, not the next one mentioned in the book. No, that was Sheila. They dated for a month before she revealed that she was both married and moving to Tasmania. And not to mention the quote-unquote drink waitress. It's safe to say that the romantic arc Lecky goes through in Melbourne in the show is complete fiction. It does, however, provide a reason for him to aim a pistol at his lieutenant that is, in some ways, more believable than the truth.
Lecky, what are you doing?
What?
Manning this fucking post, Lieutenant.
Are you out of your
I'm
mind?
the fucking guy on guard,
You
dude.
pull a fucking sidearm
asshole.
on an officer?
Lieutenant, I went for a quick piss. Lucky was just covering.
Fucking prick!
Stand at attention.
Fuck you! I said stand at attention! I said fuck you!
In the episode, it's implied that he's depressed after being dumped by Stella.
You're dumping me because you think I'm gonna get killed?
Bob, if you don't come back to us, I don't just lose you. Mama does too. I can't do that to her, and I won't let you.
That makes no sense.
Really though, Lecky was just blind drunk and angry about a box of cigars the lieutenant had taken from him. Either way, Lecky's demotion
what?
and time in the brig is real. Unlike Sid's Melbourne romantic interest, Gwen. Sid actually spent his time with the 16-year-old Shirley Osborne, whose
God.
older sister was paired up with his friend Deacon. According to Sid, they never slept together, but grew very close. That may not be a
know her.
consequential change in the story of the Pacific, but it was very consequential in the real Sid's life. Although
That's the girl from Transformers 2, isn't it? Ew.
he later went on to marry a girl from his hometown and Shirley, an Australian Spitfire pilot.
What?
The two stayed in touch and their children eventually married.
What?
That fact alone shows how close some of the relationships formed by the Marines in Melbourne turned out to be. In fact, for a full year after they left, the postmaster of the 1st Division recorded more outgoing mail to Melbourne than to the United States. I can imagine there are some mothers who would not have been too impressed to hear that. Anyway, while all this went down with the 1st Marines, Baz alone and the 7th Marines were a little out of the action. They were housed 20 miles southeast in the suburbs of Balcombe, Mount Martha, and Frankston. Nonetheless, there was still excitement
Morocco?
when Baz alone received his Medal of Honor from General Archer Vandergrift.
Yeah.
And though the ceremony wasn't held at the MCG like we see in the show, when it was actually awarded at the parade grounds of the 7th Regiment, the story of how he had earned it made a huge impression back in the States.
Jesus.
And no wonder, pretty soon newspapers were reporting that he had single-handedly annihilated an entire Japanese regiment
Well,
over
it's
the course
38.
of a 72-hour battle.
I mean, come on. I guess I see them taking it like a step further, but he went crazy. Did you see? He was like shooting everybody like it was a damn Doom game. Not no Call of Duty. He just turned it into Doom right there.
None of it which was true, obviously. I mean, if I heard they had a soldier like that, I'd be asking why on earth are they bringing him home? In any case, his newfound fame was decided to be more useful to the war effort than his military skill. And so on the 22nd of July 1943, he found himself ordered back to the US, where he was set to appear at a series of rallies selling bonds to help fund the war.
Wow.
The slogan of this campaign was "Back the Attack." John's part in it, alongside famous faces including Fred Astaire and Julie Garland, represented the end of his war. For now. But for the replenished and refreshed Marines of the 1st Division, their war was coming back with a vengeance. The 9 months of heaven were over, and their next mission would be to seize Cape Gloucester, a location on the western end of the 350-mile-long island of New Britain. It was hoped that the operation, codenamed Backhander, would accomplish two main goals. The first was to isolate the Japanese fortress of Rabaul, which was located on the northeastern part of the island. And the second was to help facilitate the advance of US forces on New Guinea past the Vitiaz Strait that separated it from New Britain. Both would aid General MacArthur's ultimate goal of taking back the Philippines. The Marines chafed at being placed under MacArthur's command, calling him Dugout Doug. They would chafe more in the jungles of Cape Gloucester because the terrain on New Britain was as formidable an enemy as the Japanese. Sunlight struggled to break through the jungle canopy, leaving them in perpetual low light. The ground itself had undergrowth that could reach as high as 20 feet. Marines on patrol often couldn't see more than a few yards as they tripped over the roots of 150-foot trees. Amazingly, over the course of the operation, 50 men became casualties of falling trees, about half of whom died. Really not how you'd want your war to end. The trouble started with the Marines' first steps on the island. They had been warned about what was called a damp flat just beyond the beach, which they need to wade through. In reality, noted one Marine, it was damp up to your neck. The one upside of this was that the terrain was so terrible, the enemy had ruled out the possibility of anyone landing there. Japanese officers reasoned that their strength was better spent in the defense of Rabaul in the east. So only around 3,500 soldiers were left near Cape Gloucester. On December 26, 1943, the main landings took place to the southeast of the target, while 1,500 men of the reinforced 2nd Battalion, including Roberts Leckie, conducted a smaller landing to the southwest. 3 nights later, the Japanese counterattack against the 2nd Battalion failed to break their lines. By the new year, the Marines held both airfields. Over the next couple of weeks, they set about extending their holdings, coming up against pockets of fierce resistance. But by the 16th of January 1944, most of the fighting was over. What followed were constant patrols pursuing the Japanese, who were by then under orders to retreat to Rabaul. A common sight on these patrols were abandoned enemy soldiers dying of malaria, dysentery, or fungal infections. The Marines only lost 310 men on New Britain, but the Japanese lost 3,868. And in the Pacific, the show does a great job of illustrating the discomforts of the weather and the jungle at Cape Gloucester, and most of Leckie's involvement in it is spot on. That includes Leckie's close-up solo encounter with 3 Japanese soldiers.
Wow.
Also straight from Leckie's memoir is his discovery of a Japanese chest, which was later confiscated by his lieutenant.
Well, this is a dangerous place. Any number of accidents could befall someone like Lieutenant Larkin.
Leckie really did loudly fantasize about killing him, much to the lieutenant's displeasure. But perhaps most disturbingly accurate are the actions of a young Marine Leckie calls the Kid.
What the hell? What the hell, buddy? Wait, did he kill him or?
It's a horrible moment, but completely true to Leckie's account. Finally, the side of a character named Lebec, though fictional, reflects the reality of exceptionally low morale on the island of New Britain. What is left out mainly consists of Leckie's encounters with the native people of the island.
No.
An Australian whom Leckie calls the Digger in his book accompanies the 1st Division. His role was to manage any natives that the Marines came across. With him came 4 Melanesian men, whom Leckie chatted with, even getting to know some of their tribal dialect. Later, Leckie used this skill to speak with islanders that they met while on patrol. One local man called Kolo even stayed with Leckie briefly while serving as a hostage to guarantee the compliance of his village. Kolo slept below Leckie's cot and even washed his clothes. However, before long, Kolo was taken away to serve in the officers' mess. In May, the Marines finally prepared to leave the Green Inferno. They were being relieved by army units. Yet, despite rumours that the 1st Division would be returning to Melbourne, their real destination turned out to be a small island in the Russell Chain named Pavuvu. About 8 miles wide and once home to a coconut plantation, Pavuvu turned out to be too small for effective large-scale training maneuvers.
8 miles wide?
But to the Marines bunking there, this was the least of their worries. Since the abandonment of the plantation 4 years earlier, coconuts had been raining down on its surface. Left there to rot, they had dissolved into a stinking mush. Company streets had to be paved with crushed coral just to make them walkable.
What?
And pity anyone that fell into that mess, because at first, there were no bathing facilities. The result was that the leathernecks were forced to wash in the regular downpours, and you can never tell how long they would last.
Hey, don't you quit on me, fucker!
Gotta be kidding. Not till I branched.
And even if they could get themselves clean, that wouldn't stop the swarms of rats and land crabs Marines took to setting them on fire, adding to the ever-present stench. No one could understand why Pavuvu had been picked to host the 1st Division's recovery. Well, it may not surprise you to hear that the people who did the choosing never saw it up close. The island was just picked from the air as an alternative to Guadalcanal, which was becoming overcrowded. Well-intentioned as it may have been, Pavuvu was far from ideal. But if any of the replacements ever voiced this, they risked catching hell from the Guadalcanal and Gloucester veterans, who knew things could be much, much worse.
You assholes gonna miss cleaning out oil barrels pretty soon.
Yeah. Look at Freddie Mercury here.
Humping up some fucking hill. Or across a beach. Jabs pouring.
What is wrong with you, buddy?
Pissing your pants, crying boo-hoo. And wishing you were back here with nothing asked of you but to scrub oil out of drums.
Among those replacements was Eugene Sledge,
That's
who
him.
had finally got his wish of shipping out.
It's Tim.
His good friend Sid, who wanted to go in the opposite direction, also had his prayers answered. Sid was set to go home on rotation after getting lucky in a 50-50 lottery. Amazingly, the two ran into each other almost exactly as they do in the show, just 2 weeks before Sid started his journey back to the States.
I don't believe it.
Men like Lecky with black marks on their record were not included in the lottery, but then he wasn't destined to stay on Pavuvu either. His nocturnal enuresis, wetting the bed, which had started on Guadalcanal and grown progressively worse in Cape Gloucester, finally got him transferred to a hospital on Benica. There he ran into the Marine who'd strangled the Japanese soldier on New Britain.
You know Gibson?
We were on Gloucester together. Now, before that. What's he doing here?
Your buddy wanted to get off Pavuvu and go home.
There's nothing crazy about that.
I know, right?
He attempted to steal a plane to do it. And when they stopped him, he tried to kill himself.
There was nothing Lecky could do to help the man. But he did make use of his break from Pavuvu to help another comrade in need, a Marine named Rutherford. Lecky and Rutherford had been pals back home. Now he asked Lecky to hold on to a pistol for him. Rutherford explained how he had lifted the gun from a dead Japanese major, only for it to be confiscated by a captain pulling rank. Rutherford had stolen it back, but was worried he would be caught with it, so he gave it to Lecky to take it off the island for a while. In the show, this story is given to Lecky himself, but the part about his doctor on Benica trying to buy the pistol from him is absolutely true.
Really?
You ever think about selling this?
No, sir.
You get it back when you leave.
Unfortunately, there was no actual cure for his enuresis, and Lecky soon grew resentful of the comfort at the hospital. Before long, he was back on Pavuvu with some extra rest and some new books to show for it. Speaking of books, this is where Lecky and Sledge meet in the show, though, as I said earlier, this probably never happened. Their meeting does do one important thing, though. It sets up the device for Sledge taking over narration, his Bible.
Now that explains it. You're a believer.
Yes.
You go ahead and keep it. I don't know why I have it in the first place.
No thanks. Come on.
The real Eugene Sledge used his Bible to make notes in throughout his time in action. And if a sudden increase in discipline he noticed on Pavuvu was anything to go by, that action wasn't far away. The National Museum of the Marine Corps describes Peleliu as the bitterest battle of the war for the Marines. And yet, prior to Sledge's memoir and its recreation across 3 episodes of the Pacific, it was also one of the least well known. A wider view gives some clues as to why. Having secured New Guinea, as well as islands in the Marshalls and Marianas, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz set their sights on the Philippines and the Palau Islands. The Japanese had used the Palaus throughout the war to protect their oil tankers coming from the Dutch East Indies. Among them, the tiny island of Peleliu held the largest bomber strip in the Japanese-controlled Pacific. US military planners wanted to end the threat posed by these bombers to an invasion of the Philippines. However, many people now believe that taking Peleliu was unnecessary. Shortly before the attack, high-level planners found that Japanese air power in the Philippines was weaker than previously thought, and it's possible the airfield could have been neutralized through airstrikes instead. After all, larger strongholds had been successfully bypassed at places like Rabaul. Admiral William Halsey even suggested that the attack be called off, but he was told that it was too late to cancel the operation. Meanwhile, Japanese planners saw the attack coming. They deployed the 4th Infantry Regiment, one of the oldest in the army, commanded by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, to defend the island. Unfortunately for the 1st Marine Division, Nakagawa was an acute defensive warrior. He made clever use of mining and tunneling engineers to turn the island into a fortress, complete with winding tunnels and hundreds of mutually defensive strongpoints. US troops wouldn't be able to attack one position without making themselves vulnerable to another. This was a far cry from the now predictable banzai counterattacks, which had failed to break Marine footholds on islands across the Pacific. Such wasteful tactics had been banned, replaced with a prolonged defense designed to cause maximum casualties. Making things worse, US intelligence gathering had missed crucial information about the terrain on Peleliu. The island's thick vegetation had hidden it from the air. Only when all this was burned away on D-Day did the truth become clear. Peleliu was an alien landscape of coral spires, canyons, and cliffs that made perfect defensive terrain. You couldn't even dig a foxhole in this stuff. So the attackers found themselves fatally exposed. At 8 a.m. on the 15th of September, 1944, 3 infantry regiments approached the beaches along a 3,000-yard stretch on the southwest of the island. Marines crouched in their LVTs, half boat, half tank. These vessels were designed to roll over shallow coral reefs. Robert Selecki took the gunner position on one of them as the 1st Marines hit the shore to the north. Meanwhile, Eugene Sledge of the 5th Marines ducked below the gunwales of his LVT as it rolled towards the beach in the center. The southern beach was the job of the 7th Marines. Heavy fire left 60 LVTs and amphibious trucks destroyed at the water's edge. But in credit to successful planning and training, M4 Sherman tanks began hitting the beach only 18 minutes into the attack. A new record for the Pacific War. Now, you don't see this in the show, but one of those Sherman tanks almost killed Sledge's entire mortar team when it confused them for enemy troops. Luckily, it was distracted by an enemy field gun long enough for a Marine to crawl up and identify them. However, in this episode, the US tank is replaced by a Japanese one.
Fire! Rossi, please.
Uh-oh.
Fall back 50, dig in! Let's go!
Shit.
Get forward!
Oh.
You can kind of see why they did. The battle is probably confusing enough for the audience as it is, but personally, I would have preferred if they had shown it the way it happened. The chaos of battle is a very real threat. I mean, the NCOs had to spend a full 15 minutes separating the K companies of the 5th and 7th Marines, which had ended up landing on top of each other. Sledge makes no mention of coming up against an enemy tank, and trying to fire mortars at a moving target at this close range seems unlikely. But Nakagawa did order his light tanks to make a charge, because they had no role in his defensive strategy. Leckie records their destruction in his book. Meanwhile, Sledge witnessed his first field stripping of an enemy corpse, which, as well as useful items, often included the taking of gold teeth and other macabre souvenirs. On D-Day, the Marines landed 10,000 troops. The attack had so far cost them 1,100 casualties, but that number would continue to mount. On the morning of Day 2, the most immediate threat was thirst. Marines near Sledge found a well that was cloudy with coral dust.
No! No! Ah!
Poison. That fucker's poisoned it.
The Marines had been warned that water in the island could be tampered with, and those who drank the cloudy liquid definitely regretted it. But I don't think there was direct evidence of poisoning quite like this. I'm not sure if there were goats on Peleliu, but if there were, please tell me in the comments. Anyway, when fresh water supplies finally arrived, the Marines were disheartened to learn they too were contaminated with oil and almost undrinkable.
No!
Corporal Bergen, in charge of the mortar crew, quipped that if he blew on a match, he'd be a flamethrower. Sledge remembered a work detail in Pavuvu where he'd been tasked with cleaning out oil drums, and the method they'd been told to use didn't properly clean them out. Weirdly though, the oil-contaminated water makes no appearance in the show, but the oil drum cleaning does. I wonder if this is like a deleted scene or something, possibly to leave more time for the spectacular crossing of the airfield, which Sledge remembers as his worst combat experience of the war. The Marines had to run across several hundred yards of open field and white coral runway, completely exposed to the enemy's large shells, mortars, and machine guns.
Oh.
Let's go! To Sledge, with men falling around him, it must have felt like an eternity. But in real time, the surviving members of K Company made it to the other side quite quickly. They hardly stopped, let alone took the time to fire mortars. Doing so out in the open like this would have been a death sentence. To make it believable in the show, they added cover that didn't really exist, as well as a visible enemy to fire at, which also wasn't available. Sledge and the others were running straight across to the bushes on the opposite side, not stopping for an overnight stay in an exposed building. What did happen, although not in Sledge's company, is the scene of a lieutenant ordering an off-course Amtrak to take back his wounded.
I need you to take our wounded back to the beach! No can do! We're moving out!
Hold here till we load our wounded. Then you can move your ass wherever you want.
Yes, sir.
This actually comes from Lecky's account, including the pistol used to convince the driver. Speaking of Lecky, while crossing the airfield with the 1st Marines, he and others had been pinned down inside what seemed to be the only cover in sight, a large crater. His captain sent him back to CP to report, where Lecky was caught near an ammo dump explosion. Wounded internally from the blast concussion, he was evacuated from the island and the war. It feels strange to say it given his wounds, but he'd gotten lucky one last time. For an operation that was supposed to be over in 2 or 3 days, Peleliu drastically overstayed its welcome. This was largely down to the preparation and tactical skill of Nakagawa and his 4th Regiment. In an area known as the Umerbagal, Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Marines took terrible casualties in assaults on entrenched positions. The area became known as Bloody Nose Ridge. In 5 days of fighting there, the 1st Regiment took 144 caves at a cost of 1,700 casualties, one of the worst US regimental losses of the Pacific War. On the 25th of September 1944, 10 days in, they were finally relieved. Private Sledge watched in horror as the remnants of the 1st Marines filed past them to the waiting ships. The 5th Marines would have to take their turn in the Umerbagal soon enough. But in the meantime, events in K Company are very faithfully recreated, including one terrible night where an unfortunate Marine has a loud mental break.
The guy who's gonna get us all killed, he don't shut up.
Hold him down! Hold him! Hit him with something!
No!
Also tragically accurate is the scene where a Marine leaves his foxhole during a Japanese infiltration.
The fuck? What the fuck?
How long you people been doing this? You don't get out of your fucking hole at night? Because this is what happens!
The only thing I would say is left out is the context for Sledge's run-in with an enemy pillbox.
Bergie. Bergie. In the bunker.
Ooh. Oh shit!
The actual encounter went down almost exactly as depicted, complete with Sledge nearly getting his head removed, as well as scoring his first up-close kill with his rifle. The only major difference is that it didn't happen on Peleliu. 4 days into the operation, Sledge's 3rd Battalion 5th Marines took a 2-day break from assaulting Peleliu to execute another amphibious assault on the nearby island of Nersibus. The regiment had been taking fire from the island, and the Japanese had even managed to sneak reinforcements across. So, it had to be dealt with, and it was on Nersibus that Sledge and his squad took on the pillbox. In my opinion, this seems like a pretty reasonable change. I mean, one island is enough to keep track of as it is, and like I said, the rest is spot on. Including that awful scene where a Marine removes a Japanese soldier's gold teeth while he was still alive.
Ooh.
That's directly adapted from Sledge's account.
That's what that was.
Christ, put him out of his misery! Fuck off!
In the remaining weeks of the 5th Marines' time on Peleliu, the regiment swept around to the north and began painstakingly pushing into the Umerbagul that had decimated the 1st Marines. This episode contains many more brutally accurate recreations of events from Sledge's book. First, the Mortimer accurate
Oh, Jesus, I just realized that. I thought it was just some guy's oh, no. Ugh.
Creations of events from Sledge's book.
Wow.
First, the Mortimer tossing stones into the skull pan of a dead Japanese machine gunner is exactly as Sledge remembers it. The only difference is that it was Doc Caldwell, not Mortimer Snafu, that stopped Sledge from joining in the grisly souvenir taking.
What you doing, Sledgehammer?
Thought I'd bag me some gold.
You don't want to do that.
Why not? I saw you do it.
Don't. You shouldn't do it.
The germs.
Another is the moment when Sledge's close friend Jay DeLu is almost killed by a hidden Japanese soldier while trying to relieve himself.
Oh, shit! Let me fucking shoot him! Yeah, get the bastard! Shoot! Shoot him! What the fuck is the matter with you? Why'd you take so long to shoot him?
Damn, Jay, if it ain't coming out your mouth, it's coming out your ass.
Jay's brothers-in-arms really did leave it until the last possible second to shoot his assailant, but Jay hadn't got quite to the point of dropping his trousers yet. Either way, he needed some new ones afterwards. And then later Sledge endured time as a stretcher bearer, a group who were particularly vulnerable to enemy fire. He did not, however, carry Lieutenant Hillbilly Jones. Hillbilly was killed while standing behind the turret on a tank, directing its shots. The episode depicts this as the moment that breaks Gunnery Sergeant Haney, which is particularly shocking since Haney was as hard as nails.
Come on, let's get you out of here. Come on.
A quintessential member of the old breed, Haney is accurately depicted in the show using a GI brush to scrub his balls, so it's a really heavy moment to see him finally crack. But it's only partly true. Haney tapped out of combat on Peleliu after only a few days, well before Hillbilly was killed. As a 46-year-old volunteer, no one blamed him. When it was all over, he admitted to Sledge, "That was terrible. I ain't never seen nothing like it. I'm ready to go back to the States. I've had enough after that." His company had landed on Peleliu with 235 men on the 15th of September. It's left on the 30th of October with only 85 unhurt.
Wow.
That's 65% casualties. Of its original 7 officers, only 2 made it back to Pavuvu. Meanwhile, 10,900 Japanese soldiers had been killed. Only 19 were taken prisoner. As he disembarked back on Pavuvu for rest and recuperation, Private Sledge found himself horrified by the presence of Red Cross women handing out grapefruit juice.
What?
Hi, welcome back. It's good to see you.
After all he had seen, it just didn't seem right for them to be there. John Basilone, on the other hand, didn't feel right not being there. While the Bond tour hadn't been his comfort zone by any means, no one could say he hadn't done his part. But Basilone wasn't willing to take a well-earned retirement until the job was done. Upon hearing this, General Vandergrift personally promised him that he would be among the first Marines to land in Tokyo. At John's request, he was transferred to the brand new 27th Infantry Regiment, 5th Marine Division. It was so new, in fact, that when Basilone arrived, there was almost no one there. Assigned to Baker Company's machine gun platoon, John entered their quarters to find only 2 men.
That's crazy.
Names?
Tatum, Charles, Private First Class. Evanson, Steve, Private First Class.
Charles is actually Chuck Tatum, the later author of the book Red Blood, Black Sand. Chuck recognized Basilone immediately and was in awe. His partner, who Tatum secretly nicknamed The Lump, wasn't as perceptive. Basilone gave Chuck and his roommate the job of cleaning up the place. Later, he would give personal instruction to Tatum on how best to fire his machine gun. However, I don't think their acquaintance was quite as long-lived as is implied in the series. Sergeant Basilone wasn't with Baker Company for very long before he was transferred to Charlie Company, along with a promotion to Gunnery Sergeant. Whereas in the show, it simplifies this by keeping him in the same company throughout, which also gives John the chance to deliver this speech in response to a B Company Marine who says he wants to quote-unquote slap a Jap.
Slap a Jap.
That's what the enemy is to you, huh?
A fucking bucktooth cartoon dreamed up by some asshole on Madison Avenue to sell soap. Well, let me tell you something. The Jap I know, the Japanese soldier, he has been at war since you were in fucking diapers! Now, you can call them whatever you want, but never, ever fail to respect their desire to put you and your buddies into an early grave.
It's a fantastic speech, which is adapted very faithfully from Chuck's memoir.
Wow.
But it wasn't given by Basilone. It was delivered by Sergeant George Lutchkis. Anyway, not long after his transfer, John met Lena Ricci, not in the mess hall, but at a hotel bar. Her character seems to be spot on, though, as she was not easily impressed by Basilone.
Look, LA is full of girls for a guy like you. You'll do fine. Happy hunting, Sergeant.
She did leave him with the number of the officers' mess where she worked, though. Lena didn't think John would call, but he did. 5 months later, they were married. But not before John had to make another huge decision. His 4-year enlistment ran out just days before his wedding, a final opportunity to retire. Instead, Basilone shipped out again, committing himself until the end of the war, plus 6 months. That put him on a collision course with Iwo Jima.
You crazy bastard, you.
Iwo Jima, with its dormant volcano, was an eerie place, cold, craggy, and barren. Its beaches were covered with volcanic sand and ash. Its interior, a tangle of hundreds of caves. Not to mention, it was Japanese territory, just 650 miles from Tokyo. The reason for choosing Iwo Jima was because of its strategic location, halfway between the American B-29 Superfortress bomber bases in the Marianas and the Japanese mainland. Its capture would put US fighters within range to escort these B-29s on bombing runs of Tokyo. Garrisoned by 22,000 men, largely of the 109th Division and 2nd Mixed Brigade, Iwo Jima was defended using tactics designed to drag out the assault and inflict maximum casualties. To achieve this, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kobayashi stationed his men in the north of the island, a fact that was missed by US intelligence. That meant the initial bombardment was completely misdirected at the southern beaches. The Pacific throws us in mid-action as the Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions hit those beaches on the 19th of February, 1945. The plan was for the company's B and C of 1st Battalion, about 500 Marines, to take the southern end of the airfield, Motoyama No. 1, alongside companies of the 2nd Battalion. Basilone was in the 3rd Infantry Wave, arriving 8 minutes after H-hour. Once again, the over-heroics of John Basilone are backed up by the historical record. On top of his Medal of Honor, they earned him a posthumous Navy Cross. The citation records his actions, and I quote, "When his company's advance was held up by the concentrated fire of a heavily fortified Japanese blockhouse, Gunnery Sergeant Basilone boldly defied the smashing bombardment of heavy caliber fire to work his way around the flank and up to a position directly on top of the blockhouse. And then, attacking with grenades and demolitions, single-handedly destroyed the entire hostile stronghold.
This guy's awesome!
And its defending garrison. Later in the day, he coolly proceeded to the aid of a friendly tank, which had been trapped in an enemy minefield under intense mortar and artillery barrages, skillfully guiding the heavy vehicle over the hazardous terrain to safety, despite the overwhelming volume of hostile fire. He pushed forward with dauntless courage and iron determination until, moving upon the edge of the airfield, he fell, instantly killed by a bursting mortar shell. Here the show is actually more accurate than the citation. John did indeed assault the blockhouse, but with some help from his fellow Marines. Not least the suppressing fire from Chuck Tatum's machine gun.
Charges ready to move! Captain, up here! Aim for the gun port! Short burst!
With the blockhouse gunner suppressed, Basilone sent Peg, a demolitions expert, to throw a satchel of C2 explosives into the aperture. This was followed by a burst from a flamethrower, at which point Basilone swapped his rifle for Tatum's machine gun and fired it from the hip into the escaping Japanese. As the group moved further, their position came under bombardment from their own navy. Basilone instructed the men to hold their position while he went back for more. On his way, he guided 3 tanks that were struggling on the terraces to solid ground. Finally, with more men in tow, John ran towards the runway, where he was fatally hit by bullets in the neck, groin, and left arm. Apart from compressing how quickly this all happens, this show couldn't be much more accurate. The same can't quite be said for Sledge's time on Okinawa, where I'd say some of the most interesting changes from the source material take place. The first thing worth noting is that we joined Sledge and the 5th Marines already well into their campaign on the island. That might be because the landings themselves went off without a hitch. Command was expecting 80 to 85% casualties on the beach, and one lieutenant actually said this to Sledge and the others in a briefing beforehand. So you can imagine they were expecting the worst. Instead, their landing went unopposed. Amazingly, 4 divisions landed simultaneously along several miles of beaches in a near flawless operation, putting some 60,000 men ashore in a single day. Of course, waiting somewhere on the island were over 100,000 soldiers of the Japanese 32nd Army, as well as 20,000 men of the Okinawan Home Guard, but they were nowhere to be seen. The fact that these landings were taking place on April 1st didn't escape the Marines. They felt they were walking into a trap. But if it was a trap, they had no choice but to spring it. Okinawa would be the final staging post for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. To that end, the initial assignment of the 1st Division was to cut the island in two, advancing across it to the eastern coast. Encountering very little resistance, the Marines arrived with their objective days ahead of schedule. They then spent the rest of the month mopping up the relatively idyllic countryside of central Okinawa. That is, apart from a short break to assault Takabanare, a nearby island which turned out to house nothing more but a few civilians. Sledge actually had time to learn some Okinawan and chat with locals, some of whom spoke English. This period of relative peace couldn't last though. On the 1st of May 1945, Eugene's 5th Marines moved into the south to relieve the decimated 106th Infantry Regiment of the Army's 27th Division. Under heavy fire, the Marines took up their positions. From there, the path of the 1st Marine Division led southward towards Awacha, Leawacha, Takeshi Ridge, Takeshi Village, Wana Ridge, Wana Village, and Wana Draw, followed by the heavily defended Shuri Heights. They'd be in combat for the next 50 days. Along the way, there would be places such as Wana Draw, where the fighting was so fierce that it was impossible to remove the bodies of Marines and Japanese soldiers alike. Instead, the men lived among the corpses, which began teeming with flies and maggots. Instances like Sledge having to dig through a Japanese corpse are straight from his book.
Sir, there's a dead body in there. Whole island's a graveyard. Get in your hole and start digging.
Also straight from the book is the slide down a muddy slope into the maggot-covered body, although Sledge saw this happen to someone else rather than having to go through it himself. Meanwhile, the rain poured, sometimes for days on end, filling every foxhole with muddy slurry. Cases of combat
terrible.
fatigue climbed as the conditions pushed
Whoa.
men to the edge.
Oh,
Episode
he
9
ate that
captures this
punch.
in the fraying relationship among the Marines of Sledge's squad. But the most literal manifestation comes when newcomer Private Peck cracks.
Sit down! Come on, you fucker!
What the fuck?
Stay down!
Get him down! Ah, man!
It's definitely a tragic moment, but Peck and the Marine he gets killed are both fictional. That said, I think the event is based on a real moment from Sledge's book. A friend of his who was on Peleliu suddenly took off for the ridge, yelling, "They've killed enough of my buddies, I'm going after him." Sledge tried to stop him, but it took a sergeant grabbing the man by his shoe to drag him down. At which point, the veteran immediately burst into tears. Now, I've said that Peck is made up, but his nickname Kathy does come from a real replacement that Sledge was friends with. Kathy got the name because of an affair he had with a girl named, you guessed it, Kathy. However, his characterization here is completely different. For example, the scene where Peck lets the ammunition get wet, causing a series of misfires, is a demonstration of a more general point made in the book.
Fire!
No!
Namely that later new arrivals hadn't been properly trained. They cracked more easily under the conditions, but also made simple mistakes. Such as when one rookie threw a series of unarmed grenades at the Japanese, which obviously all came straight back with his oversight fixed. Replacements also tended to die or get wounded so quickly that the veterans didn't have time to learn their names. But it's the scenes involving the Okinawans that I find most interesting, and which also has the biggest changes. First, there's the element of the suicide bomber.
No. No. No, the baby's dead! The baby's dead! No! Wow.
Now, this doesn't come from Sledge's book, but there are records of Okinawan civilians being used as human shields by the Japanese army. There is also evidence that some were instructed by the Japanese to commit suicide rather than allow themselves to be captured by the Americans. In some cases, this involved providing them with 2 grenades, one to throw at the US troops and the other to throw among themselves. But I couldn't find any instances of suicide belts being used. This may have been included to tap into the wider context of the wars at the time in Afghanistan and Iraq, where this tactic was being used to devastating effect. The other scene is with this Okinawan family, who are killed by a mortar Sledge directed on their hut. There's no mention of this in his memoir, though the civilian casualties on Okinawa were staggering. Indeed, as many as 42,000 died in the fighting. What is mentioned in the book is the moment when Sledge finds an elderly Okinawan woman suffering from a gangrenous wound. She motions for Sledge to put her out of her misery with his rifle, but Sledge refuses. Instead, she dies from her injuries as he holds her in his arms. It's a harrowing scene, but the truth is even worse.
No.
When Sledge found the woman in real life, he refused to shoot, then ran outside to call a medic. As he explained the situation to a corpsman, they heard a single M1 shot ring out. They both turned to the hut to see a Marine walking nonchalantly out of the door. They asked him if he'd seen anyone inside, and he replied, "Just some old woman who wanted me to put her out of her misery, so I obliged her." Sledge and the corpsman blew up at him, but that was all they could do. The woman was dead. They sort of cover this with the moment right after, where a Marine shoots a young, unarmed Japanese soldier. In fact, this situation feels almost designed to make shooting him as indefensible as possible.
Yeah, I got him! How's that? Clean shot! Got me a jab!
So why not go all the way and show what really happened with the woman? Despite the massive human cost all involved, the 1st Marine Division finally finished the fight by taking the Kunishi Yuza Yaeju escarpment. That marks the end of Japanese organized resistance on the island. All in all, the battle for Okinawa cost the Americans 40,000 combat casualties, plus 26,000 non-battle casualties, the latter being mostly combat fatigue cases, or we would now call PTSD. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers spent their lives to slow the US advance, trying to hammer home the message that taking Japan itself would be too costly to be worth it. Only 8,000 were taken prisoner. On the 21st of June 1945, Okinawa was finally declared secure. Sledge wrote in his book, "If I were a dramatic storyteller, I would find a romantic way to end this account while looking at the fine sunset off the cliffs at the southern end of Okinawa." Funny he should say that, because that's exactly what happens in this episode.
Really?
There's also just enough time for one final inaccuracy. This line about a cigarette lighter Gunnery Sergeant Haney gifted to Sledge at the end of episode 7.
Gunny Haney gave it to me. Took it with him from Guadalcanal all the way to Petaluma.
It's a nice symbol for how far the division has come by the end of the war, but there's just one problem. The symbol on the lighter, it's an insignia of the 1st Marine Division. So what? Well, if you look closely, you'll see the word Guadalcanal. That's because it was created in 1943 after the Battle of Guadalcanal, hence the Southern Cross, which was a fixture of the night sky on the island. So either this lighter had the insignia added later, which I suppose is possible, or Haney couldn't have carried it with him the entire time. My guess is they just thought we wouldn't notice. Anyway, while the Marines began cleanup operations on Okinawa, the American leadership couldn't fail to notice the grim mathematical realities. Extrapolating the terrible cost of taking Okinawa, they prepared for the invasion of the Japanese home islands of Kyushu and Honshu. The operation would be called Downfall, and the projected casualties to take Kyushu alone were placed at 268,000 American troops.
Jeez.
On top of that, there would inevitably be a huge cost to both the Japanese civilian and military populations, plus whatever it would take to seize Honshu. This has been cited as the main justification for the use of atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which led to the deaths of 105,000 Japanese. Even more died later from the after effects of radiation. Some have questioned this logic, as well as whether the decision was as binary as invasion or atomic bomb. But it's worth remembering that conventional incendiary bombing raids on Japanese cities had already begun, and by the end of the war, those alone killed close to 300,000 people. Not to mention that Japanese occupation had already killed, by some estimates, 30 million people across Asia without the use of atomic weapons.
Wow.
On the 15th of August, 1945, after the second bomb found its target, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of the Empire of Japan.
Okay, I'm going to say this now. There are a lot of people that go around and say that America never should have used the atomic bomb on the Japanese, but the things that they did across Asia, especially in China, deserved way worse. I'm sorry. I know I can't really make that call, or I can't make that kind of judgment or whatever. I don't know, but like I feel, I mean, you know, only God can make that decision, but they deserved way worse than what they got, because the things that they did were just evil. And as he said too, it really would have prevented millions of more people would have been, the war would have kept going if they had not had used the atomic bomb. And you know, the Japanese people would have suffered even worse probably, which is a real shame.
The final episode of The Pacific covers Lecky and Sledge's return home after the war. These homecomings almost seem to be happening at the same time, but really there was quite a long gap. Long enough for the contents of an entire book by Sledge about his time stationed in China. To be fair, it wouldn't really make sense to include all of this, but I'll just say there was a little bit more involved that is implied by this line.
Somebody had to stay and clean up after the war?
If you're interested in hearing more, I'd recommend checking out the book China Marine, but this video is already long enough. What I will
wanna
say
know.
is that this final episode very accurately conveys the PTSD that Sledge suffered for years afterwards, as well as his unwillingness to return to his pre-war pastime of hunting.
And he even said that he was afraid that that was gonna happen. That's so sad. He knew it.
Also true and very telling is the moment at the Alabama Polytechnic
Cleans up
Institute
good.
where a registrar got frustrated because Sledge couldn't name any training he was given that was valid for a college credit.
Isn't there anything the Marine Corps taught you that you can continue at Bandit
Michelle
Poly?
Williams?
They taught me how to kill chaps. I got pretty damn good at it.
It's a perfect illustration of the challenges faced by men like Sledge in adjusting to civilian life. Indeed, Lecky shared Sledge's feeling that the people back home simply didn't understand what men like him had been through. In 1951, now married to Vera, he went to see the musical South Pacific on Broadway. As they walked out, Lecky said, "I have to tell the story of how it really was. I have to let people know the war wasn't a musical." You can say that again. His book, Helmet for My Pillow, was published in 1957. Sledge, on the other hand, began putting his account of the war to paper in 1946, using notes he had made in his Bible, as well as longer pieces he had written on Pavuvu and in China. But he continued working on the manuscript until 1980. Funnily enough, Sledge wanted to call it Band of Brothers.
Really?
In 1981, it was published as With the Old Breed. Until it was finished, he never described his war to his wife Jean, whom he married in 1952, but she heard from Sledge's aunt never to wake him by touch when he was having a nightmare. Otherwise, he would leap at her throat. She instead learned to whisper "sledgehammer" in his ear. For her part, Lena Basilone never remarried, saying, "Once I had the best, I couldn't settle for second best."
Aww. Oh.
No historical review of the Pacific would be complete without mentioning the costumes, sets, and special effects which, on top of being visually spectacular, are extremely well researched and reproduced. So much was done practically, whether that meant working Amtraks for the assault on Peleliu or $1 million worth of volcanic ash to recreate the battlefield of Iwo Jima. I mean, the amount of time and energy spent just to keep the Okinawa set suitably muddy is amazing. Not to mention the commitment of the actors who spent long periods of time effectively living in it. They would be the first to say, of course, that it was nothing compared with what the Marines had to endure, but it's still a credit to them and reflects the training that they were put through to portray Leathernecks.
I hope some of the Marines actually got to visit there. I don't know if that's what that was, but I hope they did.
Which included a 9-day stint in boot camp overseen by legendary retired US Marine Corps Captain Dale Dye.
Okay.
According to Dye, you can train actors to walk, talk, maneuver, and handle weapons appropriately, but convincing performances come from the heart and places in the brain that are unreachable without full and complete immersion in the alien experience of intimacy, lack of privacy, total interdependency, deprivation, hardship, and unselfish devotion to a larger ideal. And he's not kidding here, he really meant it. The actors and extras were up at 5, served 2 ration meals a day, completed training in physical and weapons drills, were woken up by enemy ambushes, and even staged a full-scale amphibious assault. The instructors even went as far as to split the extras who would be betraying Japanese from the Americans and put them under an authentically different training regimen. This mock IJA force was trained fully in Japanese under the code of Bushido. At one point, Captain Dye had to rein in their instructor, ex-Marine Brad Harstel, because his recruits were too often and too successfully infiltrating the Marine trainees' lines. They even had better food. I think it's fair to say, in terms of faithfully telling the story of the 1st Marine Division, the Pacific does an amazing job of sticking to the history.
It really does.
Sure, there are characters merged, stories simplified, and quite a bit of a romantic license taken, maybe a bit too much, but overall, you really can't fault this series for the authenticity of its narrative. But there are also drawbacks to that approach. As I've said, the war in the Pacific doesn't fit a standard TV series structure. Its geography is confusing, its victories partial, its units disjointed, its tactics barbaric, and its outcome abrupt. And while I do still think it was the right move to make use of the personal accounts of Marines, the churn of secondary characters can make it difficult to follow on a first watch. In particular, the first 4 episodes are at times quite confusing and listless, since there isn't a clear indication of where this is all going, or who we should get attached to. To top it off, the main character gets replaced halfway through. All that being said, the more I've learned about how accurate this is, the more I felt that it does exactly what's needed to convey some of the hard truths about this conflict. Like the fact that the Division took 162% casualties over the course of its time in the Pacific.
Wow.
Obviously, the primary goal with a show like this for HBO has to be entertainment, but you can tell that, like Robert Leckie and Eugene Sledge, the producers felt a responsibility to the Marines who had suffered on the battlefields not to sand the edges off their story, and in the case of the legendary John Basilone, not to overplay the heroism, since it was already there in abundance, lifted directly from the source material. As Admiral Chester Nimitz said of the Marines on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue.
Honestly, a fantastic episode. I think it was even better than when he did the other history buffs, which I gotta watch again. The 1914. I forgot what it was. But 1916. Yeah, it was 1916. So yeah, this whole thing was amazing. I love learning a little bit. I actually really do have to watch the show. I also do have to watch Band of Brothers for this channel, like for history buffs. I might actually do that soon because I have not actually watched that. I think I might have watched it once, but I don't really remember it. But yeah, I do love learning about this. But yeah, it really is. The whole thing is abrupt because, you're going in and in and in. The whole story is like, you're just jumping from island to island, and I could see how it could get confusing to everybody. I mean, at least with Midway, it seems to be a little bit more straightforward, and even though there's like dogfights and boats and everything, so it can, I guess it can lose focus. And as I've gotten older, I've noticed that losing focus really can sink or swim a film. So what do you guys think about this show? If any of you watch this in the channel below, please let me know in the comments. And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and dirty content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And remember, sign up for my Patreon for all my latest reactions to all my latest videos.